It's February 21st, 1965 in Harlem, New York City. The Audubon Ballroom on 166th Street and Broadway is filling with people on this cold Sunday afternoon. They're here to see Malcolm X, the most controversial black leader in American history, speak about his new organisation and vision for racial justice. By 2:30 p.m, about 400 people have gathered in the main ballroom, including women and children. For the first time in months, Malcolm has allowed his pregnant wife Betty and their 4 daughters to attend. Outside, the scene is strangely quiet. On any typical Sunday when Malcolm speaks here, the New York Police Department stations 20 to 24 officers around the building. Today, there are only 2, and they've been ordered to remain in the small Rose Ballroom on the 2nd floor, as far from the main hall as physically possible. This unprecedented absence of security on February 21st will later fuel decades of speculation about who really wanted Malcolm X dead. For nearly a year, Malcolm has been living under constant threat. Death has been stalking him since his dramatic split from the Nation of Islam in March 1964. Phone calls in the middle of the night promising to kill him and his family. Armed men chasing his car through Los Angeles streets. A near-fatal poisoning in Cairo while dining with Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Just 1 week ago, Molotov cocktails were thrown into his Queens home at 2 a.m. while his wife and children slept. Malcolm had to pass his daughters through the windows to safety while standing in the freezing February night in his underwear. At 2:50 p.m, Malcolm's assistant Benjamin Karim begins the introduction. The crowd settles as Malcolm approaches the podium at exactly 3 p.m. He greets the audience with the traditional Arabic greeting, As-salam alaikum, and they respond, Wa alaikum salam. He's about to begin his speech when a disturbance erupts in the 8th row. Take a look at what happened. A man jumps up shouting, "Get your hand out of my pocket!" Another man nearby stands and shouts back, "Cool it, man! Cool it!" The audience turns to look at the commotion. Malcolm steps from behind the podium, raises his hand in a calming gesture and says, "Cool it, brothers, let's cool it." These are the last words he will ever speak. A man in the front row stands, pulls a sawed-off shotgun from under his coat, and fires directly into Malcolm's chest from a distance of less than 15 feet. The blast tears through Malcolm's body, creating wounds so large that witnesses later say you could put your finger through each hole. As Malcolm staggers backward from the shotgun blast, 2 more men rise from their seats and open fire with semi-automatic pistols. 16 bullets tear into Malcolm's body in less than 10 seconds. The shots hit his heart, aorta, and vital organs. Take a look at what happened. Malcolm's hands come up reflexively, then he stands completely still for a moment as if suspended. Then he topples backward, his head striking the stage floor with a sickening crack that echoes through the ballroom. Blood immediately begins pooling beneath him. His wife Betty, a trained nurse, rushes to the stage screaming. She attempts mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it's futile. She looks up at Muriel Feelings, one of Malcolm's supporters, and says through tears, "He's gone, and I'm pregnant." The assassins try to escape in the chaos. People are screaming, diving under chairs, rushing for exits. One gunman, Thomas Hagan, also known as Talmadge Hayer, is shot in the leg by Malcolm's bodyguard, Reuben Francis. The crowd catches Hagan and begins beating him savagely. They would have torn him apart if police hadn't finally arrived to arrest him. The other 2 assassins vanish into the pandemonium, disappearing down the ballroom stairs and into the Harlem streets. Gene Roberts, one of Malcolm's bodyguards, who's actually an undercover NYPD officer, attempts to give Malcolm artificial respiration. Malcolm's shirt is torn open, revealing the devastating wounds. Mary Kochiyama cradles Malcolm's head in her lap as his life drains away. She later describes watching him exsanguinate, watching his brown skin turn ashen white as the blood leaves his body. Within 3 minutes of the first shot, Malcolm X is dead at age 39. The most disturbing detail comes next. Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center is directly across the street from the Audubon Ballroom, literally 30 yards away. But when Malcolm's supporters call for help, the medical staff refuses to come. They have to physically go to the hospital, take a stretcher without permission, carry Malcolm's body down the ballroom stairs themselves, and wheel him across Broadway. Only when they arrive at the emergency room do the medical staff even look at him. They pronounce him dead without attempting any resuscitation. The 2 men who carried the stretcher are then arrested for stealing hospital property. To understand how Malcolm X ended up murdered on that stage, we need to go back to his origins. Born Malcolm Little on May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, he grew up in America where racial violence was commonplace and systematic. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and supporter of Marcus Garvey's black nationalist movement. This made the Little family a target for white supremacist groups. When Malcolm was 4, hooded members of the Black Legion, a violent splinter group of the KKK, surrounded their house in Lansing, Michigan, smashing windows with rifle butts. 2 years later, their home was burned to the ground by white supremacists. The all-white fire department watched it burn. But the most traumatic event came when Malcolm was 6. His father was found dead on the trolley tracks, his skull crushed and his body nearly severed. The authorities ruled it a suicide, claiming Earl Little had somehow managed to bash in his own skull and lay himself across the tracks. The life insurance company used this ruling to deny payment to Louise Little, Malcolm's mother. The psychological and economic pressure destroyed the family. Louise Little suffered a complete mental breakdown and was committed to a state mental hospital, where she remained for 24 years. Malcolm and his siblings were scattered to different foster homes. Despite showing exceptional intelligence, Malcolm was told by his white teacher that his dream of becoming a lawyer was no realistic goal for a nigger. By 16, he had dropped out and moved to Boston, then Harlem. In Harlem, Malcolm transformed into Detroit Red, a street hustler involved in gambling, pimping, drug dealing and armed robbery. By 21, he was arrested for burglary and sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison. It was in Charlestown State Prison that Malcolm Little died and Malcolm X was born. His brother Reginald introduced him to the teachings of the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam preached a unique theology that mixed Islamic terminology with black nationalism and racial mythology. Elijah Muhammad taught that black people were the original inhabitants of Earth, that white people were devils created by an evil scientist named Yaqub, and that a great spaceship would one day destroy white America. While the theology seems bizarre today, the nation's message of black pride, self-reliance, and resistance to white supremacy resonated powerfully in the ghettos. Malcolm began corresponding with Elijah Muhammad and immersed himself in study. He read everything in the prison library, copying out the entire dictionary by hand to improve his vocabulary. When he was released on parole in 1952, he was a completely different man. Malcolm immediately went to Detroit to meet Elijah Muhammad in person and soon became a minister in the Nation of Islam. Over the next 11 years, Malcolm X became the nation's most powerful voice. When he arrived, the organisation had 400 members. By 1964, largely due to Malcolm's organising and charisma, it had 40,000. He established mosques in cities across America, created the newspaper Muhammad Speaks, and became the face of black rage to white America. Take a look at what happened. His appearance on the 1963 television programme The Hate That Hate Produced made him a national figure. When asked his name during court proceedings, he would say, Malcolm X. When pressed for his slave name, he would respond that his father didn't know his real name because it was taken during slavery, replaced with the name of the slave master. This simple act of defiance electrified black audiences who had been taught to be ashamed of their African heritage. Malcolm's rhetoric was deliberately provocative and uncompromising. While Martin Luther King Jr. preached nonviolence and integration, Malcolm declared that blacks should achieve freedom by any means necessary. When King spoke of turning the other cheek, Malcolm said if someone puts their hand on you, send them to the cemetery. He called white people devils to their faces on national television. He mocked civil rights leaders as Uncle Toms begging for acceptance from their oppressors. But Malcolm was more than just fierce rhetoric. He was a brilliant strategist who understood media manipulation decades before social media. He knew that his extreme positions made Martin Luther King's demands seem reasonable by comparison. As he later told Coretta Scott King, "I'm here to be the alternative that makes them deal with Dr. King." He was the bad cop to King's good cop, the threat of violence that made non-violence a palatable option for white America. The relationship between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad was complex and ultimately tragic. To Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad was more than a leader. He was a father figure who had given Malcolm purpose and identity. Malcolm's devotion was absolute. Former Nation members recall that Malcolm rarely spoke Elijah Muhammad's name without adding the honourable before it. He ended every speech with all praise is due to Allah and his messenger Elijah Muhammad. But by 1962, cracks were beginning to show. The first major rupture came with the death of Ronald Stokes in Los Angeles. On April 27, 1962, Los Angeles police raided a Nation of Islam mosque, shooting 7 unarmed Muslims and killing Stokes, who had his hands raised in surrender. Malcolm flew to Los Angeles immediately, ready to organize retaliation. He gave fiery speeches declaring that the time for turning the other cheek was over. But Elijah Muhammad ordered him to stand down. The nation would file lawsuits, not seek revenge. Malcolm was forced to swallow his rage and preach restraint, contradicting everything he had been saying for years. Members noticed his discomfort. The warrior who preached self-defense was being muzzled by his own organization. The real shock came when Malcolm discovered that Elijah Muhammad, the man who preached strict sexual morality and condemned Malcolm's own past relationships, had fathered at least 8 children with 6 teenage girls who worked as his secretaries. 2 of these young women had previously been involved with Malcolm himself before he introduced them to Elijah Muhammad. When the women came to Malcolm for help, he was devastated. His father figure, his prophet, was a hypocrite and predator. Malcolm tried to rationalize it at first, comparing Elijah Muhammad to biblical prophets who had multiple wives. But he couldn't maintain the self-deception. He began investigating, gathering affidavits from the women, documenting the paternity of the children. He brought this evidence to the nation's leadership, expecting them to confront Elijah Muhammad. Instead, they turned on Malcolm. The final break came on November the 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy had just been assassinated in Dallas. Elijah Muhammad, fearing government retaliation against black organizations, ordered all ministers to make no comment. But when asked directly at a speech in New York, Malcolm couldn't help himself. He said Kennedy's assassination was a case of chickens coming home to roost, meaning America's violence abroad had come home. The white press spun this as Malcolm celebrating Kennedy's death. Elijah Muhammad used this as a pretext to silence Malcolm, suspending him for 90 days. But it soon became clear this was permanent. Word went out to all nation mosques that Malcolm's name was never to be mentioned again. Members who had worked with him for years were told to shun him completely. Some began calling for his death. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm formally announced his break from the Nation of Islam. He revealed his plans to form 2 new organizations: Muslim Mosque Incorporated for religious worship, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity for Political Action. He would no longer be constrained by the nation's policy of non-engagement with politics. He was ready to work with other civil rights organizations, ready to take the struggle international. But first, he embarked on a transformative journey. On April 13, 1964, Malcolm left for Mecca to perform Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage. What he experienced there fundamentally challenged his worldview. He found himself praying alongside Muslims of all colours, white, brown, Asian, African, all treating each other as equals. He wrote to his wife, "I have eaten from the same plate, drunk from the same glass, and slept on the same rug while praying to the same God with fellow Muslims whose skin was the whitest of white." This didn't make Malcolm suddenly love white America or abandon his fight against racism, but it did give him a new framework. The problem wasn't white skin, but white supremacy as a system. There could be white allies in the struggle if they genuinely committed to destroying racism. He returned from Mecca with a new name, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, though he kept Malcolm X for public recognition. Malcolm spent the summer of 1964 travelling through Africa, meeting with heads of state, building connections with newly independent nations. His goal was revolutionary: to bring the United States before the United Nations on charges of genocide against African Americans. He met with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. These leaders pledged support for his UN initiative. Take a look at what happened. In Cairo, while dining with Egyptian officials, Malcolm suddenly became violently ill. He barely made it to his hotel room, where he collapsed, vomiting and convulsing. A doctor who examined him said he had enough poison in his system to kill 10 men. Malcolm survived but was weakened for weeks. Who poisoned him remains unknown, but the sophistication of the attempt suggests intelligence, agency, involvement, rather than the Nation of Islam. Back in America, Malcolm was a marked man. The Nation of Islam's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, published increasingly violent cartoons depicting Malcolm's severed head. Louis Farrakhan, then known as Louis the Bass, wrote that Malcolm was worthy of death. Temple meetings featured songs about killing Malcolm. His former brothers had become his assassins. but Malcolm suggested his troubles went beyond the nation. After being barred from entering France in February 1965, he told associates that he had made a mistake thinking his problems came from Chicago, meaning the nation's headquarters. He pointed south toward Washington, implying the federal government was orchestrating his demise. FBI documents released decades later confirm they were conducting massive surveillance on Malcolm, though the full extent of their involvement remains classified. The firebombing of Malcolm's home on February 14, 1965 should have been the final warning. At 2:45 a.m, Molotov cocktails exploded in his living room while his family slept upstairs. Malcolm managed to get Betty and the children out safely, but the house was severely damaged. The authorities' response was shocking. Instead of investigating the attack, they suggested Malcolm had bombed his own home for publicity. Fire officials claimed the gasoline bombs were thrown from inside, physically impossible given the evidence. Malcolm knew his time was running out. Friends describe his final week as that of a man saying goodbye. He told his photographer Robert Haggins not to leave town because he would need to document what was about to happen. He instructed associates to leave the country for their safety. He spent extra time with his daughters, taking them for walks, buying them gifts. He told Alex Haley, who was helping write his autobiography, to speed up the work because time was short. Yet Malcolm made a puzzling decision that haunts his supporters to this day. He refused to allow security searches at the Audubon Ballroom. For months, his bodyguards had wanted to check people entering his speeches, but Malcolm insisted this would alienate potential supporters, making the OAAU seem paranoid and militant. Even after the firebombing, even knowing assassins were coming, he maintained this policy. His security chief, Reuben Francis, later said this was Malcolm's one unforgivable mistake. February 21st, 1965, arrives with a sense of doom. Malcolm spends the morning at the New York Hilton, where he's been staying since the firebombing. He makes phone calls, including one to his half-sister Ella in Boston, telling her he loves her. He seems resigned, almost peaceful. Associates later describe him as a man who had accepted his fate. The setup at the Audubon is perfect for an assassination. The two police officers stationed in the building are in a separate room with orders not to leave. Malcolm's bodyguards are scattered through the audience rather than concentrated near the stage. No one is searched entering the ballroom. The assassins have apparently conducted surveillance. They know exactly where to sit for clear shots, exactly when Malcolm will be most vulnerable. The assassination itself is executed with military precision. The distraction in the 8th row draws everyone's attention, including Malcolm's. The shotgun blast from the front row ensures a fatal wound even if the pistol shots miss. The multiple shooters from different angles create crossfire, making escape or protection impossible. The entire operation takes less than 15 seconds. What happens after is equally revealing. Despite the Audubon being in the middle of Harlem, despite gunshots that could be heard blocks away, police response is mysteriously slow. When they do arrive, they seem more interested in crowd control than pursuing the escaped assassins. The crime scene is contaminated within hours, mopped clean before proper forensic examination. The investigation that follows is either incompetent or deliberately sabotaged. Thomas Hagen is caught at the scene, clearly guilty. But the two other men arrested, Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson, are almost certainly innocent. Both were well-known Nation of Islam enforcers whose faces would have been recognised by Malcolm's security. Multiple witnesses placed them elsewhere during the assassination. Even Hagen, in a 1977 affidavit, swears they weren't involved and names the real killers, Nation members from the Newark Mosque. Take a look at what happened. During the trial, the prosecution's case is built on shaky witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. No physical evidence links Butler or Johnson to the scene. No fingerprints, no weapons, no credible witnesses who actually saw them there. But they're convicted anyway, along with Hagen, and sentenced to life in prison. The real killers, named by Hagen as William Bradley, Wilbur McKinley, and Leon Davis, are never arrested. Bradley lives openly in Newark for decades, even attending Nation of Islam events. Multiple people know he was involved, but law enforcement shows no interest. The message is clear that some assassinations are meant to remain unsolved. Malcolm's funeral on February 27, 1965, draws 22,000 mourners to Harlem. The Unity Funeral Home has to use a special glass-topped casket because so many people want to see him one last time. Actor and activist Ossie Davis delivers the eulogy, declaring, "Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood." This was his meaning to his people, and in honouring him, we honour the best in ourselves. The funeral procession to Ferncliff Cemetery is surrounded by extraordinary security. Police helicopters circle overhead. Snipers are positioned on rooftops. Roads are blocked for miles. The authorities claim this is for protection, but mourners see it as intimidation, a final insult to Malcolm's memory. Betty Shabazz carries a pistol in her purse, prepared to defend herself and her children if necessary. The immediate aftermath sees violence and fear grip the Black Freedom Movement. The Congress of Racial Equality offices are firebombed. Martin Luther King receives increased death threats. Civil rights workers across the country report being followed and harassed. The message from Malcolm's assassination is clear: to challenge the system too forcefully is to invite death. But Malcolm's influence only grows after his death. The autobiography of Malcolm X, published posthumously, becomes one of the most important books of the 20th century, selling millions of copies, inspiring generations of activists worldwide. His speeches are studied in universities. His phrase, "by any means necessary," becomes a rallying cry for liberation movements, from the Black Panthers to Palestinian resistance. The questions surrounding his assassination multiply over the decades. FBI documents released under the Freedom of Information Act reveal extensive surveillance, infiltration, and disruption of Malcolm's organizations. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, specifically targeted Malcolm as a black messiah who could unite and electrify the masses. But crucial documents remain classified or heavily redacted even 60 years later. Gene Roberts, the bodyguard who attempted CPR on Malcolm, is revealed years later to have been an undercover NYPD officer. He was also present at the assassination of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton in 1969. The revelation raises disturbing questions about how much authorities knew in advance about the assassination plot. In 2021, 2 of the 3 convicted assassins, Muhammad Aziz, Norman Butler, and Khalil Islam, Thomas Johnson, are officially exonerated after serving decades in prison. Islam had already died in 2009, maintaining his innocence to the end. The Manhattan District Attorney admits the FBI and NYPD withheld evidence that could have proven their innocence. The city and state pay $36 million in settlements, but no one is held accountable for the wrongful convictions. Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's widow, raises their 6 daughters alone, eventually earning a doctorate in education and becoming a university administrator. She maintains dignified silence about the assassination for decades, focusing on preserving Malcolm's legacy rather than seeking revenge. In 1997, she dies from burns suffered in a fire set by her grandson, Malcolm's namesake, who was struggling with mental illness. The tragedy seems to echo through generations. Malcolm's daughters continue fighting for justice, demanding the release of all government files about their father's assassination. They point to inconsistencies in the official story, the presence of undercover officers, the mysterious removal of security, the hospital's refusal to help. They want to know not just who pulled the triggers, but who gave the orders, who facilitated the killing, who covered it up. The assassination's impact on the Black freedom struggle is immeasurable. Malcolm was moving toward building coalitions with civil rights organizations, international solidarity with African nations, and a human rights framework that could have transformed the movement. His death removed the most articulate voice for black self-defense and nationalism at a crucial moment in history. Some historians argue that Malcolm's assassination, even more than King's 3 years later, marked the end of the civil rights era's revolutionary potential. Without Malcolm as the radical alternative, the movement lost its leverage. The establishment could ignore King's nonviolent demands without fear of Malcolm's more militant approach gaining support. Take a look at what happened. The pattern is clear across history. Leaders who threaten the fundamental power structure, who build international coalitions, who unite oppressed people across racial and national lines, don't survive. Malcolm understood this. In his final speech the night before his death, he said, "It is a time for martyrs now, and if I am to be one, it will be for the cause of brotherhood." Today, Malcolm X remains simultaneously one of the most celebrated and misunderstood figures in American history. Mainstream culture has tried to sanitize him, focusing on his post-Mecca moderation, while ignoring his radical critique of capitalism and imperialism. Others freeze him in his Nation of Islam phase, using his early anti-white rhetoric to dismiss his evolved philosophy. But Malcolm's true legacy lies in his fearless truth-telling, his refusal to beg for freedom. his insistence that black people had the right to defend themselves against aggression. He gave millions permission to be angry about injustice, to stop seeking white approval, to love their blackness without apology. He connected the struggles of African Americans to colonized people worldwide, understanding that racism and imperialism were global systems requiring global resistance. The Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm died was left to decay for decades, a deliberate erasure of history. It was partially demolished in the 1990s, despite protests from activists. Today, part of it houses the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center, but most New Yorkers pass by without knowing a revolutionary was murdered there. The investigation into Malcolm's assassination remains officially open but practically dormant. The real killers named by Hagen were never prosecuted. The government agencies that surveilled Malcolm for years claim to have lost crucial documents. The full truth may never emerge, buried under decades of cover-ups and classifications. What we know for certain is that Malcolm X was killed for what he represented, that black people didn't need white validation, that they had the right to defend themselves, that their struggle was connected to anti-colonial movements worldwide. He was killed for refusing to stay in his lane, for evolving beyond the boundaries others set for him, for becoming too dangerous to let live. His assassination was meant to send a message that there were limits to how far black leaders could go, lines they couldn't cross without consequences. But Malcolm's words and ideas proved impossible to kill. Every generation rediscovers him, finds inspiration in his journey from criminal to revolutionary, his courage to change and grow, his willingness to die for his people's freedom. In his autobiography, Malcolm wrote, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made." America has never healed the wound of Malcolm's assassination, never fully acknowledged the forces that killed him, never addressed the systems he died fighting. Until it does, his ghost haunts the nation, demanding justice not just for himself, but for all those silenced for speaking truth to power.